This video serves as a comprehensive introduction to the topic of alien implants. It begins with a survey of the literature on implants over the last 80 years, and then moves into the biological and metallurgical analysis of 13 analyzed implants. Before getting started, there's two important things to clarify. First, the term alien is being used broadly. We could have used terms like non-human intelligence or others, but the important connotation is that there is some type of intelligence, often in association with the UAP, in the context of an encounter where an implant is discovered. Second, in abduction experience or literature, you'll find references to different types of implants: embryo implantation, information implants or downloads, and object implantation. This third category of object implantation is the focus of this episode. Object implantation refers to encounters or abductions when an abductee or experiencer recalls the insertion of an object into their body or discovers an object from their body after the fact. According to Dr. Don Donderi, an associate professor at McGill University, these implants are often placed in the nasal passage or deep inside the eye socket, among other parts of the body. In the abduction and contact literature, the main areas of implant include the ear, the nose, the eye, the body-neck area, and on a genomic level. Before we get into any of the material analysis of implants, let's cover some of the literature on how implants are usually described. Let's start with the ear. A typical ear implant refers to an object being inserted into the ear, usually with what's described as a pencil-like instrument made of light or some type of metal. A beeping or ringing noise is reported during and afterwards. Implants of this type can be found in James and Amy's encounter in Taken, as described by Dr. Carla Turner, in Gamita's implant, reported by Cynthia Hind in her book UFOs Over Africa, and by Leah Haley in both of her books Alien Closets and Lost Was the Key. And very intensively, it's described by Carol, the abductee, at the 1992 MIT Abduction Conference. There is another type of ear implant that reoccurs throughout the literature in the outer area of the ear known as the pinna. Usually it's discussed in the connotation of it heating up and getting hot or red. This is the case for the well-known abductee Whitley Strieber, who describes how the object would go red and heat up over time, once in front of a doctor and once at a conference where both Whitley and other abductee Kim Carlsberg each had glowing red ears that were burning to them. They also reported warbling noises. Whitley eventually got an x-ray proving that there was in fact a metallic object in his outer ear, but during an attempted surgical removal, the object moved repeatedly on camera, evading extraction. The object remains in his ear today and is described as having a coiled structure. Nasal implants are statistically one of the most reported types of implants across the literature. A common nasal implant usually features a light wand with a small BB-like object on the end being inserted up the abductee or the experiencer's nose. This is often accompanied by a cracking noise, nosebleeds, and nasal scarring. A classic type of this implant would be one from the mid-1940s in Truman, Kentucky. This was researched by Bud Hopkins in his book Intruder at Copley Woods. The woman in question describes at 5 years of age the insertion of a long, thin needle going up her nose with an object on it and the object hurting inside of her head. Other nasal implant cases include, and there's quite a few here, so bear with me, Casey's implant in Into the Fringe by Dr. Carla Turner, Beth's implant in Taken, also by Dr. Carla Turner, Jill and her son's implant in Preston Dennett's book Inside UFOs, Taylor's implant in the same book Inside UFOs, Beverly's implant in The Custodians by Dolores Cannon, Jeff Silver's implant in The Rising, Sandra Larson's implant, originally researched by Dr. Leo Sprinkle, a double abduction researched by John Carpenter and reported in the 1996 MUFON Conference Symposium, and then another double abduction also reported by John Carpenter, but this time presented at the 1992 MIT Abduction Conference. Virginia's testimony at the same MIT Abduction Conference also featured a nasal implant, as does Brett Holdham's implant in his book Children of the Greys, as well as Kathy Davis and Linda Cortile's implant, also reported by Bud Hopkins. If you have the chance to visit the Strieber archives at the Archive of the Impossible at Rice University, you'll find in Box 2, letter number 99, and Box 10, letters 478, 31, and 48, reference to nasal implants as well. These are, at least at the archive, a small sample as there's many tens of thousands of letters there. What's important about all those recollected cases of implants is that these testimonies have certain similarities attached to them. The experience of a thin straw or light wand going up the nose of the person, a crackle or pop of the bone when the implant is inserted, also oftentimes the accompaniment of pain described by the subject, but not always, and frequent nosebleeds after the fact, as well as unexplained nasal scarring. Nosebleeds are a bit of a special category in this because without conscious recall of an implant per se, nosebleeds are themselves a commonly documented side effect of alien abduction. So it remains to be determined if every nosebleed is the result of an implant or if some may simply be due to procedures done during their abduction. As we'll see later on in this episode, this is the case for Dr. Bruce Rapuano, a neuropharmacologist who wrote a book, Dominion Lost, suffered a number of nosebleeds after his encounters, and also discovered nasal scarring later on in his life, but never actually found an implant. Eye and head implants. Eye and head implants may very graphically include the removal of an abductee's eye from its socket, followed by the insertion of a small object behind the eye. This is described by Leah Haley in Lost Was the Key, by Betty Andreasson Luca in the Andreasson Affair, by Sean Bartok, a professor of graphic design that writes about this in his book Flashbacks. And most interestingly, in Whitley Strieber's book, The Communion Letters, there's details of an encounter that talks about a boomerang slicing open a person's head such that what looks like rubies and a sapphire are planted in various portions of the person's brain before their head is shut again and the boomerang seals it once more. Body implants make up the bulk of the 13 cases analyzed that we're going to discuss later on. Body implants are typical in the neck, the spine, the fingers, the wrist, the shin, the toe, and the foot area. In other words, body implants could be found in many parts of your body. The final category in the literature worth mentioning is known as genetic implantation. This is best described by Katharina Wilson in her book, The Alien Jigsaw. I'm going to put the quote up on the screen for you. She writes, "They've performed procedures to implant what I believe genetic material or enzymes or chemicals that I feel might affect my genetic makeup. They have taken skin samples, blood samples, hair samples, measurements of my body, and have performed brain stimulation for brain mapping procedures on me. They're also interested in my thoughts, emotions, and beliefs." Genetic implantation is similarly found in the story of Mary and Cherie, as written or as researched by Dr. Artie Sixkiller-Clark in her book Encounters with Star People, and in Brenda's account in The Custodians by Dolores Cannon. While all of these cases of implants show a similarity across abduction experiences, there's one specific description that I think best encapsulates the bizarre mystery behind these types of encounters. This is the case of Betty Andreasson Luca, researched by Raymond Fowler over 10 years and published across 3 books, The Andreasson Affair Parts 1, 2, and The Watchers. J. Allen Hynek, the head of the U.S. Air Force Project Blue Book, certainly respected the case, as he writes in the prologue of The Andreasson Affair the following: "And those who still hold that the entire subject of UFOs is nonsense will be sorely challenged if they have the courage to take an honest look at the present book." When it comes to the implant in the case of Betty Andreasson Luca, there are many stages to the event that we're going to walk through and that I'll illustrate for you. The event took place in 1950 and includes the placement of an object in Betty's eye after her eye was removed from the socket, as well as other objects going into her spine and her ankle. I've assembled the sequences of this experience as described in the book to just give you a sense of how bizarre and unintuitive the process may seem. So sequence 1 is on board the craft. Betty's brought up to a machine. In sequence 2, Betty places her fingertips on colored round circles of the machine and is told to follow the white ball across the screen, a calibration of sorts. She's then shown a platform with many tiny slivers of what apparently looks to be glass and is told that some of them are for her. In the next sequence, she's put on an operating table and her eye is taken out. Slivers are placed in her head, spine, and ankle, with her neck and shoulders feeling extreme heat. After this, she reports feeling that something is moving inside of her head. The removal of the implant is done in a later abduction in 1968, in which it's taken out of her head via her nose using what we've described before as the light wand. So the question that will take us into the realm of physical and analyzed evidence is whether these abduction accounts have parallel physical or scientifically analyzable effects that mirror the so-called experience of the abductees. A natural segue to that physical evidence would be the medical diagnostics of Dr. Richard Neal, MD. He interviewed and physically examined the psychological and personal injuries of 75 alleged alien abductees. He wrote about these examinations in his book, Generations of Abductions, a Medical Case Book. Here are some of his most important findings. The nasal cavity, ears, eyes, and reproductive organs are the physical area of greatest interest. A thin probe with a tiny ball on it is commonly described, accompanied by a crushing type of sound and nosebleeds. Many of the individuals subjected to nasal probing have a history of chronic sinusitis, and ear and eye probing is also common with similar instrument. Unaccounted for scars on the calf, including just over the tibia or shin bone, the thigh, hip, shoulder, knee, spinal column, right sides of the back, and forehead are also common. So with this in mind, let's go through the scientific study of implants using modern analytical and imaging tools. This is the bread and butter of the physical evidence of implants, and I've collected 13 different cases from the literature to share with you. Case number 1, Betty Dagenais. Some background context. Betty reported years of contact, including toning, which is beeping or blurring noises in her ears, and like Whitley Strieber and Kim Carlsberg, she had a lump in her pinna, the outer part of her ear. In 1986, Betty had an experience in which she was told, quote, directly by her abductors that she would die if she had the object taken out of her ear. Very cleverly, Betty left instructions to her family to have the object autopsied after she passed away, and in 1989, the object was autopsied. 6 years later, an electron microscope analysis found the following about the object. It was a dark 1 millimeter object. It was comprised of aluminum, titanium, silicon, and traces of many other metals, and the analysis deemed the object to be a transducer to send signals, and that analysis did not have context on where it came from or the circumstances of its removal. That was just the blind analysis from the laboratory. Case number 2, Jesse Long. Some background context here. Jesse Long had conscious recall of the object going into his shin at 4 years of age. 34 years later, in 1989, the object was removed with the surgery that was both videotaped and photographed. The doctor described the object as, quote, a glass-like fragment resembling the shard of a broken bottle, 1.5 centimeters long, 3 millimeters wide, and 1 to 1.5 millimeters thick. The doctor observed there was no attempt of Jesse's body to reject the object, and when the object was removed from the body, it was removed with no encapsulated minerals, suggesting that the object was never recognized by the body in the first place. Remember that because it'll come back later on in this episode. In 1996, the object was subjected to electron microscope scanning, infrared spectroscopy, and X-ray diffraction. The full composition of the object was found to contain silicon, potassium, calcium, iron, and a number of trace materials that were too small to analyze. What's interesting is that while doing this analysis, the researchers compared Jesse's implant with a control object of a normal glass shard. They observed that with a scanning electron microscope, the glass shard induced severe charging and scatter, while Jesse Long's implant had almost no reaction at all. If you have a chance to make it to the University of Rice, you can find in Box 10 Folder 2 the official opinion of the Southwest Research Institute on Jesse Long's implant. They write the following. In conclusion, the implant does exhibit unique surface characteristics. Case number 3, Dr. Colette Dowell's implant. Dr. Dowell reported a lifetime of contact experiences, beginning with consistent dreams about UAPs, followed by a number of dreams about alien abduction. Only in 1986 did a CAT scan of Dr. Dowell's brain find a normal pituitary gland, but also, quote, a 3 millimeter non-enhancing nodule in the left lobe. In 1989, an MRI scan from Cedars-Sinai Medical Center confirmed the CAT scan with, quote, a 3 millimeter zone of high intensity. In 1990, Dr. Dowell was diagnosed with visual dysfunction typical of pituitary adenoma. In 1994, another MRI confirmed this again and recommended preparations for surgery. 10 days later, in a final pre-surgery scan, they observed, quote, no visual defects as if the object was removed. You can find the MRI images and the CAT scans in Box 10 at the Archive of the Impossible, as well as the field visual reports. The official report writes, showing lights missed and unexplained improvement 8 days later. Case number 4, is in letter number 711 from the Archive of the Impossible. This is an anonymous letter, or it has to be kept anonymous, but it details a long saga of encounters that's particularly relevant with the physical analysis that's provided with the letter. The author writes about how at first an ear, nose, and throat doctor, when examining the author's left nostril, was certain that the author had to have surgery because of old scar tissue that was present. In 1992, the author had their first x-rays done. The x-ray revealed several bright, reflective, roundish clusters in the area of their heart or mid-upper abdomen on the left side that the technician defined as questionable metallic pellets. The document present in the folder with the letter is from a Department of Medical Imaging of 1991 that shows the area of the body with the metallic pellets, with the verdict stating beneath, questionable metallic pellets seen upper mid-abdomen. The Roger Leir surgeries. So the next set of cases comes from the well-known book, The Alien and the Scalpel, written by Dr. Roger Leir, who emerged close to 30 years ago as a true pioneer in the removal and analysis of alien implants. Some context should probably be helpful on what I will refer to as the Dr. Roger Leir saga. From 1994 to 2014, Dr. Roger Leir removed a total of 18 objects from alleged abductees, mainly from their legs and feet. The reason why this book and the cases within it are so interesting is because the process of a removal were extremely scientific. All of the surgeries were recorded on video. Patients provided a full medical history and a full history of their encounters, and every patient was psychologically evaluated prior to going into surgery. During this timeline and in this saga, the book's right here, individuals such as Robert Bigelow, Colonel John Alexander, Los Alamos Labs, and New Mexico Tech will surface in the analysis of the removed implants. To his credit, Dr. Roger Leir's novel innovation in the field was to preserve the removed objects in a biological fluid taken from the patients themselves, so as not to disturb the implant or risk it reacting to being removed from the body of the patient. He says this in his own words: every implant was put in a serum taken from the blood of the patient, as it was used as an ideal storage mechanism for these implants. The first surgery conducted by Dr. Roger Leir removed 3 total objects from 2 different individuals, Patricia and Paul, who each had consciously recalled encounters with UAP, but had not known each other prior to the surgeries. This first surgery took place in 1995. Patricia's implant, which we'll refer to as case number 5, happened 30 years prior to the implant removal. 2 objects were found in her foot via an unrelated x-ray scan. One was described as being small and seed-like, and the second was described as being T-shaped. There was no scar or surgery reported by the witness prior to the implant removal. Upon removal, it was found that both of the objects inside of Patricia were enclosed by a dense membrane. This is going to feature prominently when we look at the results from Paul's implant. Case number 6. Paul's encounter was consciously recalled at the age of 6 years old. The x-ray found an object embedded in his hand without a portal of entry or scar in his hand. Upon removal, the object was described as a cantaloupe seed encased in a dark membrane as well. Prior to the removal of Paul's implant, Dr. Leir observed some bizarre reactions of Paul's hand when he passed over it with a Gauss meter, which is usually used to measure strength and direction of magnetic fields. The Gauss meter began pulsating and buzzing when it passed over Paul's hand, which prompted Dr. Roger Leir to ask Paul to go outside, from which he tested it once more with the same results. So there's 2 key results involved in the removal of these objects. The first is the analysis of the membranes that surrounded the objects, and the second is the metallurgical analysis of the objects themselves. And it's important to note that Roger Leir subjected both the membranes and the objects themselves to a double-blind analysis. That means that 2 different pathologists and laboratories were used in studying samples. Let's start with the membranes surrounding Paul and Patricia's implants. After the surgeries, 2 different pathologists reviewed membrane samples and sent Dr. Roger Leir the results. Dr. Roger Leir recalls being shocked by the results because of 3 key features that were found in the membrane analysis. First, there was no inflammatory tissue. Second, nerve proprioceptors were found deep within the tissue of each sample. And third, and most interesting, all 3 of the objects fluoresced in a brilliant green light when subjected to black ultraviolet light. In addition, both membranes were found to be composed of the same materials despite originating from 2 separate people who hadn't known each other prior to the surgeries. Those materials were keratin, homociderin, and protein coagulum. The lab pathologist was unaware that the objects came from two different people and, quote, had never seen anything like them before. Metallurgical findings. In collaboration with the National Institute of Discovery Science, or NIDS, which is the Robert Bigelow-backed Research Institute, and with the help of Colonel John Alexander, both of these samples were sent to Los Alamos Labs and New Mexico Tech for a number of blind tests. These tests include density immersion, mechanical properties analysis, X-ray spectroscopy, scanning electron microscopy, X-ray diffraction, and electrical magnetic properties analysis. We'll call the two small objects, one from the hand of Paul and the other from the foot of Patricia, T1 and T2. We'll call the larger object from Patricia's foot that was T-shaped T3. So starting with the results of T1 and T2, despite coming from two different people, they happen to have very similar compositions. That included a predominantly iron core, surface layer materials of phosphorus, calcium, and chlorine, and they also noted that the hardness of the core is very high in the neighborhood of high carbon tool steels. The T3 sample, they write, quote, is a very complex mixture of materials totaling 11 different elements. The inner core is presumed to be similar to T1 and T2, with the outer core consisting of iron, silicon, phosphorus, molybdenum, chlorine, sodium, and calcium with traces of copper. In a letter of opinion, they offered the hypothesis that the object might be made of meteoric material and suggested a number of different meteorites that had displayed similar contents. This is from the blind analysis of the New Mexico Tech laboratory. In May of 1996, Dr. Roger Leir announced a second set of surgeries. The only major difference from the first set of surgeries was that this time there were guests invited and allowed to sit outside the surgery room and watch the surgery proceed on live stream. These guests include Dr. John Mack, Bud Hopkins, Johnson Takano, the director of the Space UFO Science and Technology Center in Japan, as well as Whitley and Ann Strieber, among others. I'm going to be focusing on 3 patients in the second set of surgeries and 3 objects removed from those patients. That's going to be cases number 7, which is Annie. The object removed was described as a cantaloupe seed object from her leg. Case number 8, Doris, also with a cantaloupe seed-like object from her leg. And case number 9, Dawn, who had a triangular object removed from his jaw. An initial analysis of the second set of surgery showed 2 major takeaways that had strong parallels to the first set of surgeries. Those takeaways were that there was a lack of inflammatory response from all 3 subjects, and all of the objects fluoresced under ultraviolet light, but they weren't all green. Dr. Roger Leir describes a spectrum ranging from green to pink when the objects were subjected to UV light. We'll start with the metallurgical analysis of Dawn's implant. The X-ray showed a foreign body in the lower left jaw. It was described as being triangular and small, metallic, and once more covered in a dark membrane, similar to the first round of surgeries. It was found to be composed of aluminum, calcium, copper, and iron, with minor concentrations of magnesium, manganese, sodium, and silicon. There were 4 key findings from Annie and Doris's objects. The reason I'm lumping them together is because they were very similar to one another. As Dr. Roger Leir writes, quote, each revealed a little round ball of grayish white material found deep within the tissues but attached to the underside of the skin. Microscopic examination demonstrated 4 key findings in both of the samples. So this is once again a case of 2 patients not being familiar with one another prior to the surgeries, but having very similar implants analyzed after their surgeries. The first discovery was focal blood vessel lumen obliteration and chronic perivascular inflammation, or in Dr. Roger Leir's words, the interior cavity of the blood vessels had been destroyed, and there was a great deal of inflammation surrounding the vessels themselves. There were also collections of nerve tissue found in both of the implants, no foreign body reaction to either of the implants, and most interestingly, solar elastosis. Solar elastosis, as Dr. Roger Leir explains, meant that a deeper layer of the skin, the dermis, inside of both of the patients had been subjected to a large and intense amount of ultraviolet light, while there were no other marks of this type anywhere on either of the patient's legs. And this was consistent for both women, despite them having vastly different experiences. The following graphics summarize the findings of Dr. Roger Leir in The Alien in the Scalpel. On page 164, you can see a snapshot of the different surgeries. You can see when they happened, who was involved, areas where the surgery took place, the composition of the material removed, the form of the material removed, its color, if there were nerves present, if there was a membrane, if the objects were inflamed, and then obviously the diagnosis of being what might the origin of the object have been. On page 168 of the alien scalpel, you get the element concentrations in the removed objects, and you'll note for the list of the objects that are detailed, there's a symbol connotating if there's a major concentration, a minor concentration, just a trace concentration, or nothing found is left blank. As a general takeaway, almost all of the specimens fluoresced under ultraviolet black light. No patients showed indications of psychotic behavior, and no evidence of an entry wound was found at any of the implant sites. It was mentioned before that these 6 implants were not the only implants that Dr. Roger Leir had dealt with. He had actually removed 18 in total. This brings us to case 10, the case of Tim Cullen, which was actually done in 2001. Tim's encounter took place in 1978 with his wife in the car in Yuma, Colorado. After 20 years of silence, Tim wanted to get his wrist examined as he suspected an implant was embedded in his wrist. And lo and behold, the x-ray found a metallic foreign body in his left wrist area. A trimeter reading over his wrist revealed a midband on the magnetic and electric scale, showing some type of response. Once it was removed, it was, as in the case we've seen of other cases, cantaloupe seed-shaped. Under analysis, an atomic field microscope detected bubbles, eggs, or small sacs that were filled with an oily substance. Working with a laboratory in Texas, a material analysis determined the main component was amorphous iron that was highly magnetic. As Dr. Roger Leir writes in his MUFON 2001 conference symposium, what amazed all the scientists was that this amorphous iron was highly magnetic and that they explained there was no such process for accomplishing this feat in normal material sciences of the day. That would be in the 2001 material science capacities. Case number 11, the John Smith implant. This is one of the most recent and one of the best analyzed implants available in the public domain. It's featured in Steve Aspen's book, The Intergenerational Abduction Program. The implant was removed in 2008, analyzed in 2009 by material scientist Steve Colbern, but then was the subject of a discussion between Robert Hastings, the author of UFO and Nukes, and Steve Colbern in Robert Hastings' 2019 book, Confession. Let's take this case from the very top. John Smith is a man in his 40s. He's married, he has 3 children, and his full-time job is as a researcher in the material science field. John Smith had a lifelong history of UFO sightings and missing time experiences, and on the suspected encounter of the implant, John Smith recalls seeing 2 unusually large raccoons outside of his window before going to sleep. He woke with a burning pain on the tip of his left toe, and then later on found 2 puncture wounds near the toe. One of the puncture wounds was found to fluoresce green under UV light. The X-ray scan found an object that appeared to look like bent wire with no inflammation or immunological reaction detected. The CAT scan confirmed that there was a foreign object in the toe. Upon removal, the object was described by Dr. Roger Leir as brittle, cylindrical, and broke into 12 pieces. What makes this case so interesting is the discussion of the implant analysis between Robert Hastings and Steve Colbern. Let's start with the inductively coupled plasma mass spectroscopy results, also known as ICP-MS. This was performed by an independent laboratory on the object, and what did they find? Putting this up on the screen for you. A total of 51 elements were detected in John Smith's implant. They included major components of iron, nickel, silicon, cobalt, phosphorus, and calcium, and major trace elements were detected including iridium, gallium, and germanium, which Steve Aspen notes is rare on Earth but abundant in iron-nickel meteorites. The isotropic analysis showed significant differences between the isotropic distributions of most of the sample elements for which isotopic data was available. The 4 ratios that were much far out of whack than what you would find of an isotope of an earthly material were in boron, magnesium, nickel, and copper. You can see this on page 279 of Steve Aspen's book. The scanning electron microscope found artificial nanostructures that they termed carbon nanotubes, suggestive of electrical current carrying pathways. Radio waves of 1.2 gigahertz, 110 megahertz, and 8 hertz bands were detected in the immediate region of the patient's body. According to Robert Hastings, this shows that some type of signal was being transmitted. And a magnetic field reaction was observed in relation to the neodymium iron boron magnet. So, key conclusions. Steve Aspen lists out 8 key conclusions in his book. I'm just going to give you guys the 3 that I find most interesting here. The first one is that the precious metals of tungsten, gallium, germanium present, quote, strongly suggest that the metallic portion of the sample was derived from meteoric iron and is extraterrestrial in origin. Second conclusion was that the extreme differences in the isotopic ratios of the sample elements from the normal Earth isotopic ratios provide strong confirmation that the material in the sample was manufactured in an extraterrestrial environment. And finally, many factors strongly indicate that this was a manufactured nanotechnological device which was inserted into patient Smith for a definite purpose. So they're combining the encounter history with the function of the implant itself. On that note, Steve Colbern, the material scientist who researched the case, writes the following: the manufacture of a device comparable to this one is probably beyond the technology of known earthly commercial processes at the present time. This is in 2009. It is most likely, therefore, the device was manufactured by an alien civilization. It's still a possibility, however, that the device is manufactured by some process known to earthly military block project community. So, it's one thing to have a story of an alleged implant by the beings themselves. It's another to have physical analysis done on a removed implant. The cherry on top would be to have a qualified scientific expert discuss the implications of the material analysis of an implant. And for that, we have Dr. Bruce Rapuano to thank. He has a PhD in neuropharmacology and is also a JD. And he's put forward the most compelling analysis of implants to date, including a thesis on implant reverse engineering programs. Bruce, in his book, goes through a number of implants, but we're going to cover 2 specifically that he explains the material analysis for and then shows how those implants were prequels to future scientific discoveries in the material science field. This is his first case, case number 12 for all we've seen, is an implant that was removed in 1998 with the help of Durrell Sims, the partner of Dr. Roger Leir. This was obtained from the nose of a child abductee, and what was described was 2 2-millimeter diameter spheres that were analyzed by New Mexico Tech labs. What they found was that the spheres were perfectly split to be made of 51% silver and 49% gold, which Bruce discusses and says are 2 of the 3 most electrically conductive metals in the periodic table. Here's where it gets interesting. Bruce writes that as of 1998, the surface properties of the spheres were not found to be replicated in nature or in any known manufacturing process of the time. But that exact same composition of 49% gold, 51% silver was found in a gold nanoalloy that was being investigated in the material science field in 2016. So the suggestion by Bruce is there some type of connection between the original implant in 1998 and the breakthrough in the material science field in 2016 because of the exact material compositions that were observed? The second case that Bruce dissects is from an implant provided by Dr. John Mack, the Harvard psychiatrist, from 1994. The implant supposedly came from the nose of a 24-year-old woman, and it's described as being a 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch wiry object. The electron microscope imagery and elemental analysis found it to be a, quote, interestingly twisted fiber made of carbon, silicon, oxygen, and other trace elements. The radiologist found it to be radiolucent and thus not metallic, and neither pathologist or radiologist were able to identify the object. So then Bruce adds this commentary to what has been observed. He says, so essentially the main composition of this object is known as silicon carbide. It's extremely rare in nature and stands out in its capacity to absorb electromagnetic waves. The most intriguing aspect of this is its mechanical elasticity. So as Bruce says, carbon fibers usually break at 2% of the strain. That means that you take a carbon fiber, you pull it out, you pull it 2% longer than its length, it will normally snap. The case of this implant was that the carbon fiber could be stretched to a length of 300% of its initial length without snapping at all. So definitely a unique material property. Bruce's theory is that the design of silicon carbide and hollow carbon fibers seems to take inspiration from this implant, albeit 15 to 20 years down the road in the future. Both, and he writes about this, he basically says, both silicon carbide and hollow carbon fibers were designed to be effective at shielding electronics from microwave electromagnetic radiation 15 to 20 years after this nasal implant was discovered from an abductee. Is it coincidence, or is it proof of a reverse engineering program? This brings us to the bigger question: what might the government know? Might the United States government know something about these implants? Is there anything in the literature or the data to suggest that? The answer is yes. Two major clues do suggest that the US government has been actively reverse engineering implants at least for the last 30 years. The first piece of evidence is a matter of public record. The second one, to my knowledge, has never been revealed before and deserves further exploration. Let's start with the first. Lue Elizondo most recently testified in the UAP hearing. He wrote in his book Imminent about implants in a number of places. Lue allegedly handled an implant from a hospital in the Department of Veterans Affairs. His direct quote is that the implants moved, quote, like a stealth bomber, without any trace of signature, almost as if evading the natural human immune response. It was as if the body didn't know the object was there in the first place. Lue then claims that specimens that have been removed from individuals in association with UAP have been sent to various medical institutions, including the CDC, the FDA, the National Institute of Health, and the U.S. Army Research Facility in Fort Detrick, Maryland. So that's the first clue that one of the government whistleblowers has written in his book that went under Doppster review that implants have been extracted and examined by a number of different federal government institutions. The second clue can actually be found, this was found totally on a fluke when I was at the archive, in letter number 467 of box 9 of the Schreiber archives. So this letter alludes to an implant analysis program within the government dating back to the 1980s. The letter was written to Willie Schreiber in 1987. And just remember, the first Dr. Roger Leir surgeries weren't till 1995. So this is 8 years before implants are really in the mainstream of the public discussion. The author writes that she's in contact with Frank Chesky, a psychiatrist from Houston, and that she's known him for 5 years, but only recently discovered that he's doing work with abductees and hypnosis with people experiencing contact. According to the author, Frank Chesky told her that there is a surgeon in the Houston area who's removed implants from people and is doing autopsies on these implants. This surgeon has several of these implants and has been in touch with an inner circle of a Navy project that's fully aware of the implications. And apparently these implications are far-reaching. So when I found this letter, I thought, okay, there's a pretty easy way to verify it. Let's see if Frank Chesky is a real person. Lo and behold, you can find that Frank Chesky was a retired colonel and a trained doctor who specialized in psychiatry in the Houston area for 27 years and recently died in 2022. This information may perhaps provide the beginning of a trail of evidence to an implant reverse engineering program stemming from the U.S. Navy. Let's summarize the alleged purpose of these implants from the last 30 years of research. Broadly, these purposes fall into three main categories, which we're going to put up on the screen. First, as a tracker. Second, as a recording, storage, or transmission device. And third, as a monitor, control, or mind enhancer, sometimes also used in the context of affecting the way an individual looks at themselves or the world, which we could say is like personal transformation. So in rapid fire, this is a number of different authorities on the topic who've researched it over the last 30 years that we'll put into this table. Kim Carlsberg, in her book Beyond My Wildest Dreams, states that implants can serve many purposes, but most prominently as honing devices and recording and transmitting devices. Leah Haley, in her book Loss Was the Key, claims that ear implants are for communicating and monitoring, while others are for information storage to be used for adaptation to a future environment. Betty Andreasson Luca writes in a MUFON 1999 article titled The Purpose of Implants that they function as trackers and surveillance of abductees. Dr. Carla Turner in Taken gives us implant rationales from Amy, Angie, and Jane. Amy explains that neck implants are used to block the brain and become the central command center of the body that can be used to control behavior, study emotions, and, darkly, as a death switch. Angie claims that implants can be used to collect data, remain in contact with them, and as information storage. Jane believes that ear implants affect brain chemicals and certain subtle functions. In Dolores Cannon's book, The Custodians, Beverly tells Dolores that implants send out a signal to them while also causing physiological effects like headaches. Dr. Bruce Rapuano's own theory is actually almost an all of the above theory. Implants can act as tracking devices. They're designed to monitor or manipulate thoughts, emotions, sensory impressions, and experiences, and they could even be used as a brain-computer interface. Raymond Fowler, the legendary researcher of the Andreasson affair, likens implants to tags that humans put on bears, but also maintains that they could be used as an awakening device. Bud Hopkins, one of the top abduction researchers of the past 80 years, says implants are used to monitor abductees and to some extent control them due to the implant's proximity to the brain and the nervous system. Jeff Selver, author of the very detailed contact book The Rising, describes implants as micro-objects in the brain that operate like an antenna. They can tune into a frequency of the mind to pick up and analyze thoughts to eventually be put into a database of sorts. He was told, quote, "It happens with technology that we cannot understand." Richard Dolan, a known historian of the field, posits that implants could be for tracking and storage, but may also interface with advanced machine intelligence. Dr. Roger Leir, the surgeon of the many implant extractions we've discussed, suggests that implants are trackers, transponders, and behavior controlling devices. Dr. John Mack, the Harvard psychiatrist, holds that abductees suggest implants are a tag to follow or find them. Bruce Maccabee, longtime researcher of the field, states they're used to connect with an abductee and signal when they're nearby, so that would be as a tracker. Dr. John D. Miller theorized that placing an implant near the olfactory nerve could be used to monitor brain activity while being hard for humans to access. He also added that with the location of the current implants, small amounts of nervous system tissue could be collected. Brad Steger claims implants are used to notify abductees of close proximity UAPs, usually through ear beeping signals. He also holds that implants lead to personal transformation. Jenny Randalls, a well-known English investigator, shared a case whereby the implant inside the abductee's head provided the person with enhanced psychic abilities. As a conclusion on the purpose of implants, from what you can see on the table, at a minimum, they may be used as trackers used to locate and monitor abductees, but they may also be proactively used to control, change, influence, and direct abductees both physically and consciously. The final area of focus that I want to look at today is the overall prevalence of implants in the abduction literature. This is both over time and in terms of frequency. Going back to 1969, Brad Steger claims that there was a spike in implant claims from dozens of contactees in the span of about 6 months. Raymond Fowler, however, in 1987, could only find 3 published accounts of implants when he was researching it in relation to the Andreasson affair. Carla Turner, at her roundtable from the 7 subjects of the book Taken, found that 6 of the 7 women sampled in depth recalled an implant, with 6 of the 7 recalling an ear implant, and 4 of the 7 recalling a nose implant. Dr. Thomas Bullard, whose comparative study on stolen time has been one of the most thorough abduction studies, covers over 300 different abduction cases, found that 8 of them involved an implant, which is an incidence rate of 2.6%. However, in 1999, Dr. Bullard published an updated 30-year review of his findings and showed the incidence of implants actually went up from 19% in 1979 to 23% in 1989 to 29% in 1999. Dr. Roger Leir writes in 2001 that he approximates only about 15% of the abductee population as having some form of implant. From Bud Hopkins' caseload, implants are observed in 11 of the 58 people, which is a sample incidence of 19%, and of those 11, 6 of the 11 went into the nose, 2 of the 11 went into the eye, and 3 of the 11 went into the ear. Dan Wright, in his seminal review of the MUFON Abduction Transcription Project, writes in 1995 that 30 of the 142 reviewed cases claimed an implant, which comes out to be at around 21% incidence. And finally, most recently, the Martin Stoner study from 2011 found that 21 of the 50 abductees sampled reported an implant for a total of 53%. So this overview suggests that implants are not by any means common in most encounters, but have been found to be more prevalent than originally thought. Some closing thoughts. In this topic, the X that marks the spot is the point whereby a scientific process has been used and a puzzling or mysterious result is discovered. We found this with certain implants on topics like membrane composition, the elemental and metallurgical analysis, and in the case of implant or abductee fluorescence under dark UV light. There's a lot of work to do on this topic, and to prepare researchers for the future, I have 4 recommendations for them in closing. Number 1, understand the encounter history of the subject. Oftentimes, the encounter history is the building block that enables a researcher to get to the material or metallurgical analysis itself. Number 2, check all subjects and removed objects under UV light for potential fluorescence. Number 3, in keeping with the recommendation of Dr. Roger Leir, keep all removed implants in a blood serum from the original subject so as to not risk the destruction of the implant. Number 4, collect data honestly and don't try to force a conclusion from the data. It's fair to say there's probably less than 24 analyzed implants in the public domain. We would want to get that number into the dozens or the hundreds before any conclusions would be made on the nature or overall purpose of implants. That's all for today. See you next time.